Assalamu alaikum and welcome to IBN TV in collaboration with Friends of Palestine. It's Yom al-Quds today and it's a very different Quds Day from every other year where we aren't able to hold the public rallies and demonstrations in support for Palestine and in standing up against oppression. However, we must look at the silver linings. Alhamdulillah, with the help of social media, we're still able to voice our concern regarding the continued injustice of the occupation of Palestine and the injustices being carried out around the world. In our previous Al-Quds talk show, we spoke to Sister Nargis Muballighi regarding the occupation of Palestine, and today we're going to zoom out a little bit and focus on the Middle Eastern region as a whole. I studied politics and international relations at university, and when I came back, the question I got asked by the members of the community the most was, how do we know who's on the right side of history in all the conflicts happening, specifically in the Muslim world? Unfortunately, there are repercussions to not having the correct information because sometimes we may share something or post a piece of propaganda that is contrary to the truth and in support of those committing injustices. Imam Ali alayhi salam has said, "Be for the oppressor an enemy and for the oppressed a friend." Step 1 is identifying the oppressors and the oppressed. Inshallah, in today's talk show, this is what we will aim to achieve. We're extremely honored to be joined by Sister Marzieh Hashemi all the way from Tehran. Welcome and thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Sister Marzieh is very well known amongst us. However, to briefly introduce her, she was born and raised in the United States where she worked in the press industry. When the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran, she was inspired by its ideals and the persona of Imam Khomeini, and she converted to Islam. In 2008, she moved to Iran and has been living there since. She works for Press TV and is involved in a lot of revolutionary projects in Iran. Without further ado, we'll jump right into the discussion. So, Sister Marzieh, when we look at the Middle East, countries such as Palestine, Yemen, and Syria are embroiled in large-scale violence, and others such as Iraq, Egypt, and Lebanon have their hiccups now and then. Then we have countries such as Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, where there is very little freedom of expression and any dissent is suffocated. Why is the Middle East such a bubbling pot of havoc? And why is it that the Western superpowers have and have always had so much interest and interference in the region?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. I'm very happy to be with you all, of course, on this very, very special day, International Day of Quds. And as you said, this year it is different, but we still have a responsibility to speak out. We're not on the streets this year, but in social media, we're doing our best to get the truth out there. The part about the Middle East or West Asia, if we want to look at it, is basically it goes back almost 100 years ago. If we look at the main agreements in the region in 1917, I believe, Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Yeah.
Right, Sykes-Picot Agreement, and what happened then, as far as what the British did, still affects us today in this region. And basically what it came down to was the British promising one thing to the Arabs, but then didn't keep their word, and of course then allowing the Zionist state to actually begin, and also the arbitrary lines that they drew in creating so-called nation states. Basically, you would have in various countries, for example, whether we're talking about Jordan or Iraq or Syria, ethnic tribes being divided or families being divided into two different states. Or the opposite is true, perhaps groups that were not as friendly with each other, then all of a sudden being thrown on one side of the border. In other words, that artificial creation of these boundaries even affects us today. And they knew what they were doing, and it's that whole divide and conquer, divide and rule mentality that the British implemented that we're still being affected today. I mean, I know myself actually growing up in the States, and I remember people always saying when they would show any type of images from the Middle East, and they would say, oh my God, all these people want to do, they just want war. They just want to fight, right? So this is the image that has been portrayed when the root of the problem actually are the imperialist powers themselves, and this is what has happened. And we look at the various countries, you mentioned a few, whether we're talking about Syria and Iraq and Lebanon that you had mentioned, as far as the problems that we've seen, especially in Syria and Iraq and the whole Daesh terrorist escapade and what took place, and so many people were killed and made homeless and made refugees. But what is the root of the problem? Is the root of the problem from this region itself, from Syria itself, from Iraq itself, or elsewhere? Well, I would definitely argue the roots of, and the main roots of this issue is from outside of this region. We know that Daesh was a creation of the United States. And it's true that they say in the media now, and also the Pentagon, the military part of the government, trying to portray that they're fighting against ISIS or Daesh, the remnants of them. But the reality is that they created, I mean, even Donald Trump, he said that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton are the ones who created ISIS, Daesh. So that tells you a lot about this. And all of these entities, such as Daesh or Al-Nusra Front and so many others, were created to destabilize the area and to keep that division up. So I would argue that what you see happening in the region, the roots are definitely outside of the region, and they want this tension and they want this destabilization to take place.
So what is the reason? What is the end goal for them in the Middle East? Why is it that they're so after having this destabilization and, you know, creating all of this chaos in the Middle East? What's their interest?
Well, first and foremost, it's it's natural resources, right? The natural resources in this region, they're great. And also, for example, in the continent that you sit on, fantastic natural resources. And that's when you've always seen the colonialists at one time, or the hegemons right now. That's where they concentrate the most on being. And it hasn't changed. I mean, this is a region filled with natural gas and oil and so many other resources. That's number one. Number two, strategically. Strategically, a very, very important area. That's why Iran has been such a thorn in their side, because of being in this region and being for resistance and not allowing others to take its natural resources. It's very important, this region, and for them to have control over it. Because if they have control, for example, of the Persian Gulf area, that means easy oil flow easy oil flow and being able to get to their ports easily. Or we're talking about Afghanistan, and of course Afghanistan is important because of its proximity also to China, and also the resources that are there too in Afghanistan. And the same is true with the majority of countries in this region. Now, Syria, for example, and Lebanon, well, the importance there, of course, is because they're next to occupied Palestine, Israel. And Israel was put in this area to begin with to create, increase instability and to continually create problems for the countries of the region. So it's multifaceted, the reasons why this happened. But again, the first and foremost is natural resources, and then strategically being able to control these countries politically. So a country like Saudi Arabia, that unfortunately is controlled by the United States and influenced by Israel, it makes a big difference, doesn't it? Because Saudi Arabia, with the amount of oil that it exports, and also its strategic importance, if it really was a country on the side of the Muslim Ummah, the situation will be quite different in the world today. So that's why they concentrate also on infiltrating and controlling governments and who takes hold of these governments. And that's why 1979 was a big problem for them when they lost one of their biggest allies in the region. That was the Shah of Iran, with the coming and the victory of the Islamic Revolution.
So really, it's all just a game of interest for those who want to satisfy their lust for power and money. Could you tell us a bit about the ways in which Western superpowers exercise their control and influence over the foreign and domestic policies of these countries, specifically in regards to the international relations within the region? For example, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, where the Saudis have been carrying out a bombing campaign against the impoverished nation for 5 years.
Right. Well, I have to say, I'll start off with saying it is really unfortunate when we look at what those external powers of the region have done here. I think first and foremost, we as Muslims have to take responsibility because had we had the unity and not been divided and had the insight to have the right leaders amongst us, then we would not have allowed them to be able to get where they are today. So that's an unfortunate part of it. And of course, there are reasons behind that too. We won't go there now. But in general, when we look at the situation, what they do, they try to make sure that they keep everyone divided. That's their policy. And they do this in various means. For example, let's take the Saudi regime that we just mentioned. With the Saudi regime, I mean, where did they come from all of a sudden? Who was behind them coming to power, a family coming to power in Arabia? Well, we go back, and again, it's the British that were behind it. And the thing about it is, it's not just Saudi Arabia, it's so many of these countries in the region. If there is a leader who actually wants to do something for his people, first and foremost, if there's an election, he won't be able to get elected. If something was to happen, that there was a leader who did not abide by what Washington was demanding or London was demanding, they're going to overthrow him. They're going to kill him. And so this is what happens throughout the region. We have seen time and time again various movements by various people and trying to actually be free from these dictators, basically, that have been imposed on them. And unfortunately, I mean, we look at a country like Egypt, for example, and we have seen throughout the time, we saw a very nationalist type of government there with Nasser. And then, of course, under Sadat, we saw them getting closer and closer to Israel, and Mubarak continuing that line and being close to Israel. Then all of a sudden, there's this so-called movement that's taking place, and then we see Mubarak being overthrown, and then we see what happened as far as with the Muslim Brotherhood, and then them taking power, and then of course them being brought down, and now we're back to a military dictatorship. Although Assisi, I mean, he's not in uniform anymore, but the same type of mentality exists. Basically, if someone tries to get away from, talking about the people, trying to get away from that sphere of being controlled by the West will try their best to stop that movement. That's why 1979 was such an exceptional year. And what happened in Iran is so exceptional. And that's why, again, I will say Iran continues to be the thorn in their sides, because it did not abide by that equation. It was a total people movement. The people demanded a change, and their number one ally, the U.S.'s number one ally, and a very close ally of Israel, can I say, the Shah of Iran, all of a sudden was overthrown. And then this revolution took place, and no matter what they have done, and they have done a lot, I can say, in these over 41 years to overthrow this government, they have not been able to do it. And that's why it's such an exception, and actually at the forefront of the resistance.
Right, so the Western powers claim that they are upholders of democracy and human rights. However, we say that it is them who then help stir up dissent against democratically elected leaders, and it's them who, support leaders who are not democratically elected and actually support the crushing of dissent against those leaders in countries such as Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. So, I mean, the question that comes to mind is, what is it that these people in the region are getting wrong what is it that's missing for them that they're not able to look beyond this control that the West has over them? And why are they so blinded? I mean, we see so many people that are westernized within the region, and their secular mindset doesn't allow them to look beyond what is being imposed upon them. What's the missing link?
Right. It's very complex because what has happened is that the Western countries, I'll talk about the United States specifically, and the strength of its media, and of course its movies and its music, its culture in general, that actually has been imposed on people across the world, and unfortunately has influenced societies east and west and the global south, right? So, and with that, it is they create this image of themselves, as you said, to be the protectors of democracy and human rights, and we know that that's not the case. That's the furthest thing from the truth. I mean, whether we're talking about, I'll tell you, inside of the United States itself, from the roots of the Native Americans to the African Americans, and now we can see the division more and more inside of that country to all of the countries that they support or do not support in the region. When we have seen freedom movements rise up, whether we're talking about in Central America, whether we're talking about in Africa or wherever, we have seen, again, I will say, reiterating, immediately the assassination of those leaders or the overthrow. Listen, themselves, actually, if we go back to comments made by former United States General Wesley Clark, and of course this was after 9/11, 2001, and that whole situation that took place, and he then started talking to people at the Pentagon, and basically he got the word that they were going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. It had nothing to do with 9/11. It was going to be an excuse, for example, Afghanistan and Iraq, but still the other countries, whether we're talking about Iran or Syria, they were going to do it because they wanted to do it, because they wanted to control that sphere of influence and also the natural resources. So we know, I mean, actually with the existence of Donald Trump as president of the US, we're actually getting more truth coming out now than probably before. And he says it's about the oil. It's about the oil. When he talks about, for example, he was talking about Iraq, he was talking about Syria, or Libya. When they're talking about things, he talks about, it's about the oil. We have to get the oil. So it's about those natural resources. Again, I will reiterate that they will do anything it takes to have control of those natural resources, and not democracy and not human rights. None of this plays in it. These are words, cliche words that are used for the benefit of the so-called, I guess, the intellectuals. Perhaps they will buy it. But the people in the region, you ask the Yemenis about the human rights of Saudi Arabia and its backers, the United States and Israel. Or you ask the people in Syria about the human rights. You ask the people of Iraq about the human rights of what they've experienced. You ask the people right here in Iran about human rights, Washington style. And you ask why people, the difference, for example, between Iran and its leadership, its perspective. It makes a big difference. It really makes a difference when you have a leadership who, first and foremost, fears Allah, fears the Creator, and knows that he has a responsibility as a leader. It's not for him to, for example, take control of the riches of the country for himself. It's not about having power, because if a person is a righteous Muslim, especially those found in the school of Ahl Bayt, then they know it's actually a bigger responsibility when you're in a leadership role. You have a responsibility, you have to answer. We go back to 1979 when Imam Khomeini, rahmatullah alayhi, left France and was entering Iran. And on the airplane, someone interviewed him and asked him, how did he feel? What's his feeling right now after those years of being away, and now the Shah's gone and he's going back and he's going to take power, basically, of this country? And he said, nothing. I have no feeling. What does that mean? It means whatever Allah wants. Because even at that time, that plane could have been shot down. He didn't know really where all of this was going to go. So it was whatever Allah wanted. That is the difference. A righteous leadership. A leadership who fears Allah and knows that He has to answer for everything that He does in this world and the next. That's what makes Iran different. And that's why Iran could survive all of this. And at the same time, anyone who stands up against this oppression, they have a heavy price to pay. They will definitely make you pay a heavy price. And it's so multifaceted as far as the depths of the prices that they will make you pay. We know on the surface as far as sanctions, the heavy sanctions against Iran. But it affects every aspect of life. I mean, I will say actually, when we were talking and we were looking at different forums to even have this on, there's certain forums, certain platforms on social media that we cannot get on because we're in Iran. So to that level, they try to make people pay a price. We have students who are doing research. They cannot get access to certain books. We cannot get, for example, from various entities that sell things and send them to your home or whatever. But it has made Iran stronger and to be able to come up with their own alternatives. And in many ways, that has made, it has been very good for Iran because it has made it stronger and it made basically Iran to depend on itself. But now think about this, if we could just copy paste this model and we would have more and more Muslim countries like this, and that liaison, that relationship that we could have and that strength could have, because the strength come in numbers. Of course, let me say though, this line of resistance has definitely grown stronger. And we see more and more people understanding that resistance is the only way. Unless you want to live a life of humiliation, you must resist, no matter the price.
And I think we're the ones to best understand this because we've got the best teachers and the best leaders, such as Imam Hussein alayhi salam, who really went through the biggest amount of pain and suffering in order for him to reach that, in order to stand up for the rightful government. And that's what the people of Iran did. They just followed the lead of Imam Hussein alayhi salam and they managed. So I think really it's about allowing the cultural invasion from the West to secularize our mindset, to really think that religion and politics, isn't one and the same thing, so that people don't allow that to inspire their ways of governance and their ways of, how they carry out their state affairs. So I want you to tell us a little bit more about the role of Iran in the region, specifically because of the accusations leveled against Iran for the defensive measures it takes in the region. For instance, Iran is criticized for entering Syria and Iraq, whereas it was invited by the legitimate governments of those respective countries, and it was in order to stop the spread of Daesh up until its own borders. Contrary to the US, who blames Iran for destabilization but is thousands of miles away and still interferes.
This is a tactic of so-called world powers to deflect from their own guilt and try to point the finger at others. Iran has the right to defend itself and to make sure the region is secure. Where does the United States fit in on this? I mean, I would love to have a map right now of the world and point out to people again, where's the United States? Where's Iran? Where's Iraq? Where's Syria? Why is it in America's interest to be in this part of the world, and they're right, but it's not in Iran's interest and it's not Iran's right to be active in its own region? I mean, it's such a ridiculous premise to begin with. If anyone just thinks a little about what is being said, had Iran not gotten involved in Syria, had Hezbollah not gotten involved in Syria, had Russia not gotten involved in Syria, is like greatly possible that Syria would have fallen. And with Syria, the domino effect, and then of course Iraq, we know that Daesh was going so fast through Iraq. And I mean, it was just unbelievable what we were seeing all of a sudden overnight. So we're talking about the fall of Syria. We're talking about the fall of Iraq. We're talking about the fall of the region. We're talking about insecurity. We're talking about Wahhabis, head-cutting terrorists taking over this region and disrupting the lives of millions of people and causing terror in the region. I don't think any country has the right to tell any country in this region that they should not be worried about their neighbors. Every country is worried about its neighbors, and it's in that country's interest. It's in Iran's interest, for example, for Iraq to be stable. Would anyone dare tell the United States that they have no right to worry about what's happening in Canada or what's happening in Mexico? Never, because no one feels that they can even tell the United States about being involved, for example, in Yemen or being involved in Somalia or wherever. But then other entities don't have the right to do that. I think we have to change the narrative to understand who is saying what, who is controlling the media, and not listening, not allowing what they say to basically to believe what they are saying. It's common sense. It's basically common sense that, of course, every country has the right to protect its region.
So it's very easy for us to lose hope in the face of the oppression we see around us. Countless innocent people die regularly, and the oppressors just seem so powerful and invincible. The verses of Quran do give us hope, where Allah recounts the stories of the prophets bearing such great hardships, but Allah granting them victory at the end of it all. What can you tell us to encourage us to keep treading this path of resistance and activism, and inspire hope in us that Allah is watching, and that the very temporary nature of the enemy's material strength will one day be finally exposed?
Right, and I know, especially for young people, it's very difficult. It's very heavy, actually, for all of us, and what we have seen in recent years, and to the extent of terror and people dying and just inhumane acts being committed. This has always been the case, unfortunately, in this world of ours. Of course, now with more sophisticated weapons, they're able to kill more people. But at the same time, I would like everyone to know that, believe me, these oppressors at one time were so arrogant, not that they're not now, but they're arrogant and afraid right now. And the reason why I say that is because we can see it in their actions. Their actions are not logical. Their actions are very up and down. They're not sure what to do. We can see, for example, with the United States and different situations happen in this region. Listen, the United States would do whatever they wanted to whatever country whenever they wanted, and no one would say a thing, right? Well, that's the way it is. But it's a little bit, it is changing. I mean, we saw last year, for example, with the situation, the United States has sent a couple of drones in this region and over Iran, and Iran shot down one of the drones and then did not shoot the next drone that actually had people on board it. And Donald Trump ended up actually thanking Iran for not doing it. Well, that's not the United States, because they're too arrogant to thank anyone. We saw that after the assassination, the terrorist assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani and Abu Muhandis in Iraq, and then Iran responded by sending missiles to Ain al-Assad. We saw that the United States did nothing, whereas that is not the United States either. So the equation is changing. The equation is changing, and this is very important. The equation will only change when we are empowered. If we are weak, if we buy into, for example, their slogans of democracy, human rights, that's not going to do anything. If we think that we can sign agreements with them and live in peace, well, we can see that that's not going to happen. How many agreements, if we look at what has happened with the Palestinians and with Israel, from Camp David on, we have seen so many peace treaties or signed, whatever. And what has happened? That we got to the point now, basically, there's no land left, and that even Jerusalem, Al-Quds is being called the capital of Israel by the United States. I mean, it is outrageous. So it shows us that talking and signing agreements and waiting for international organizations to come and save us, it's not going to do any good. It is only through empowerment, by being strong. I remember, for example, during the Iran-Iraq war, and I remember when Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons, and I remember seeing the scenes from inside of Iraq on his own people, the Kurds, and also inside of Iran when he used the chemical weapons. And the world did nothing. The world did nothing. When did the world talk about the chemical weapons of Saddam Hussein? Years later. The war took place from 1981 to 1988, and it wasn't until 2002 and 2003 that the world addressed that issue. Why? Because it was in their favor, because at that time then they wanted to invade Iraq, and they wanted to show what a horrible leader he had been. And all of a sudden then what had happened years and years earlier became a priority, because our lives are not important to them. It's all a political game. We see our Yemeni brothers and sisters basically on the edge of starvation. These kids are dying, starving. The United Nations does what? It says they condemn what is happening in Yemen. Well, that's not going to put food on the table of that Yemeni kid. That's not going to stop the Saudi bombs from going over their head. That's not going to stop the United States from refueling Saudi airplanes. Those kind of oral condemnations or written condemnations. What does it mean? What does it mean? How come when they want to, they can all of a sudden declare a no-fly zone? If they really want to do something, they could easily do that and say, okay, no Saudi planes can fly over Yemen, but they don't want to. So we understand from this that we have to take it in our own hands. And alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, as I said, the resistance is growing, the resistance is getting stronger, and believe me, the other side is definitely, they're quite fearful. If they weren't fearful, even from social media, I'll just say this, social media after the assassination of Major General Soleimani, we had people all over the world, young and old, being active on social media, and they had their accounts basically shut down. Even if they shared a picture of the general, the post was deleted. This is not a sign of strength. This is a sign of weakness. They don't even have the capacity for a picture to be shown. That means they are running in fear. So I will say to all of our young people and others, do not do not lose hope, because as you said, the Quran has promised those who are righteous and steadfast the victory. And as you mentioned, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he is our ultimate example that ultimately we will have the victory. Sometimes it may require the greater sacrifice, as he sacrificed his own life, but at the end of the day, we know who actually was victorious in Karbala. And that's the same thing with us, that we have to be patient, but know that we have made unbelievable improvement, and know that our enemies are running scared.
I think it's very, very important for us to constantly remember and remind each other of this, that, the resistance has made a lot of gains, and it's on the trajectory of making a lot more gains, inshallah, and obviously to the ultimate, goal of the Zuhur of the Imam. And that brings me to my final question, which is, why is it necessary for us as those awaiting the Imam of the time to be aware of these political realities? Is it our duty, and how would it benefit us?
Yes, well, of course, I think our responsibility prior to the Zuhur is actually trying to prepare the way for our Imam to return. Now, we have some who think that preparing for that means simply just sit on our prayer mats and dua, and of course, that is important too. We must pray, but there are other things that we must be doing. We have a responsibility to stand against oppression. And if we do not stand up against it, it just gets worse. It gets worse and worse. And basically, we just don't function. We can't just sit here and say, okay, Imam Mahdi is going to come. Yes, he's going to come, but we have a responsibility to try to help prepare the way. If all of us were just sitting down and praying for his return, I mean, I wonder who are the ones that are going to actually, the army of Imam Zaman, the army of Imam Mahdi, who are they going to be? Because we didn't try anything. We haven't tried. We haven't sacrificed. We've sat in the corner of our homes and prayed, which again, alhamdulillah, yes, praying is important, but it has to come with activity. We are part of a religion. It is a very active religion. It's not a passive religion. And Allah has empowered us and said that we have a responsibility as far as while we're on this earth to try to make it better. And we have to stand against oppression. I think that way our Imam will be satisfied with us. Not that we say, oh, what can I do? Oh, it's too much of a risk. Oh, I mean, I may lose my, I don't know, my job or my reputation or whatever. No, it's not about that. It's what are you willing to do for your Imam? Show it now. Show it now. And if we do what we're supposed to do, he'll come back sooner, inshallah.
Inshallah. I really, really appreciate this. This has been so informative and really energizing. We obviously pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of the Imam of the time and for the tawfiq for us to work on ourselves so that we may serve his cause. Thank you so much for joining us, Sister Marzieh. It's been such a pleasure and we really, really appreciate you accepting our invitation. And to all the viewers, we'll end it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.